Hello. What if theology is not merely opinion? What if studying God is not just devotional, but intellectual, rigorous, and even scientific? Today we begin our journey through one of the most influential works in Christian history, the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. And this first video is foundational, because before Aquinas talks about God, angels, morality, sin, grace, or salvation, he first asks a deeper question. What exactly is sacred doctrine? In other words, what is theology? Why do we need it? Can it really be called a science? And how does it relate to reason? Welcome to Letters of Paul to the Philippines. This is episode 1 in our series on the Summa Theologica. And today, we are exploring question 1, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. Before we enter the arguments themselves, it helps to understand how Aquinas writes. The Summa follows a very disciplined format. For each question, Aquinas presents, first, objections, arguments against his own position. Then, on the contrary, usually a quote from Scripture or an authority. Then, I answer that, which is his actual position. And finally, replies to objections. This is important because Aquinas is not afraid of difficult questions. He doesn't silence objections. He examines them carefully, and that's one reason the Summa remains intellectually powerful even centuries later. The first article asks, is sacred doctrine even necessary? The objection sounds reasonable. Human beings already have philosophy. We have logic. We have reason. Can't we discover truth on our own? Aquinas replies, reason is powerful, but limited. There are truths about God that human reason could never fully reach by itself. For example, the Trinity, grace, salvation, the inner life of God, and even truths that reason can discover, people often reach them slowly, with error, and not at all. So revelation becomes necessary, not because reason is bad, but because human beings need help. This is one of Aquinas' most important principles. Faith does not destroy reason. Faith perfects reason. Now Aquinas asks something fascinating. Can theology actually be called a science? At first glance, the answer seems no. Science depends on evidence and demonstration. Theology depends on faith. So how could theology possibly qualify? But Aquinas says theology is a science, not in the modern laboratory sense. He explains that some sciences depend on higher sciences. For example, music depends partly on mathematics. Likewise, sacred doctrine depends on the knowledge of God Himself. Its principles are not invented by humans. They are revealed by God. So theology becomes a kind of higher science, one grounded in divine knowledge. And this is revolutionary. Aquinas is saying faith is not irrational. It may transcend reason, but it does not contradict it. Next, Aquinas says, if theology talks about so many things, God, angels, human morality, sin, Scripture, is it really one science? His answer is brilliant. He says theology studies everything under one unified perspective. Everything in relation to God. That means theology has a center. And that center is not humanity, not politics, not psychology. The center is God. This is deeply countercultural today. Modern thinking often fragments knowledge into disconnected subjects, but Aquinas sees reality as unified, because all things ultimately come from and point back to God. Aquinas then asks, is theology speculative or practical? Meaning, is theology mainly about knowing or mainly about doing? Because theology discusses morality and human action, it seems practical. But because it studies God, it seems contemplative and speculative. Aquinas says it is both, but primarily speculative. Why? Because the highest goal is knowledge of God, not merely behavior modification. Christianity is not just ethics. It is first a vision of reality, a relationship with God that transforms action. Right belief and right living belong together. Then Aquinas asks whether sacred doctrine is nobler than other sciences. And again, his answer is yes. Not because theologians are smarter, but because theology deals with the highest possible subject, God Himself. Aquinas says wisdom judges all things according to the highest cause. And since God is the highest cause of all reality, theology becomes the highest wisdom. This does not mean biology, physics, or philosophy are worthless. Aquinas respected reason and natural sciences deeply, but theology asks the ultimate question: why does anything exist? Also, what is humanity for? And what is our final end? These are questions no microscope can answer. One of the most misunderstood parts of Christianity is the relationship between faith and argument. Some people think if you need arguments, you don't have faith. But Aquinas disagrees. He says sacred doctrine does use arguments, not to prove revelation from scratch, but to clarify truth, defend doctrine, and refute error. Theology cannot prove its first principles, because those come from revelation. But once revelation is received, reason helps us understand its implications more deeply. This becomes the foundation of centuries of Christian intellectual tradition. Faith seeking understanding. Aquinas also asks something surprisingly practical. Why does Scripture use metaphors and symbolic language? Why not just speak plainly? Because human beings learn through images. We understand spiritual realities through physical analogies. That's why Scripture speaks about light, bread, shepherds, vineyards, water, fire. Divine truth descends to our level, so finite minds can grasp eternal realities. And finally, Aquinas explains that Scripture contains many and multiple senses. There is the literal sense, the direct meaning of the text, but also spiritual meanings, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. In other words, Scripture is richer than surface level reading, not confusing, but layered. So what is the big picture of question 1? Aquinas is building a framework where faith and reason work together. Theology is not irrational. Truth is unified in God. And sacred doctrine is humanity's highest form of wisdom, because it leads us toward our ultimate end. This is why the Summa still matters. Not because it gives simplistic answers, but because it teaches us how to think deeply, carefully, and faithfully. And in a world drowning in noise, that discipline matters more than ever. My takeaway here is humility. Aquinas' answers to question 1 remind us that human reason is powerful, but limited. If we are not humble, we risk mistaking our partial understanding for the fullness of truth. Sacred doctrine teaches us that truth is not something we conquer by intellect alone. Some truths must also be received, and that requires humility before God. In the next Summa Theologica video, we'll continue with question 2 and explore how Aquinas begins talking about the existence and nature of God Himself. So please subscribe to Letters of Paul to the Philippines and tap the notification bell so you'll know when it comes out. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below and share this with someone interested in theology, philosophy, or the Catholic intellectual tradition. Grace and peace to one and all.